welcome. Wherever you are listening from tonight, allow the day to loosen its grip. Let the room remain dim. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to follow closely, nothing you need to hold on to, and nothing you need to stay awake for. This story will move gently, and you are free to rest whenever sleep arrives. Tonight's story takes place in a city shaped by hardship. Long rail lines, industrial silence, and a stretch of land where people passed through without being remembered. This is the story of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. In the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, a series of murders unfolded quietly along the outskirts of Cleveland. Ohio bodies were discovered slowly, sometimes months apart, often incomplete, and frequently without names. There were no clear witnesses, no reliable descriptions, and no one who could be held responsible. What made these crimes unsettling was not only their brutality, but their stillness. The victims were people already living at the edges of society. Transient workers, unhoused individuals, those whose disappearances did not immediately draw attention. Their absence blended into the background of a city struggling to survive. Investigations were launched, efforts were made. A famous lawman was brought in, and yet the case never reached resolution. The murders stopped without explanation, leaving behind questions that were never answered. This story is told slowly and carefully. There is no music, no sudden sounds, no moments meant to shock. You do not need to follow the details. You do not need to remember names or dates. Let the narration move around you like distant thought. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If sleep arrives before the story ends, allow it to come without resistance. The crimes did not announce themselves loudly. They emerged quietly, and they faded the same way. This is a story shaped by absence, by people who were never identified, by an investigation that could not hold on to certainty, and by a place where silence made violence easier to overlook. You are safe where you are. The night is calm, and the story can begin. In the 1930s, Cleveland was a city caught between growth and collapse. Industry still defined its skyline, but prosperity had thinned into survival. Factories slowed or shut down entirely. Rail yards stretched across the landscape, carrying freight, people, and uncertainty in equal measure. The city did not stop moving, but it moved more quietly than before. The Great Depression reshaped daily life in ways that were visible and invisible. Unemployment was widespread. Families adjusted to scarcity without ceremony. Many people drifted in and out of the city, searching for work, staying only briefly before moving on again. Names were exchanged less often. Faces changed quickly. Stability became temporary. Along the edges of Cleveland, entire communities formed and dissolved without record. Shantytowns appeared near rail lines and industrial corridors, built from scrap wood and salvaged metal. These settlements were informal and unregulated, existing just far enough from the city center to be overlooked, yet close enough to attract those hoping for opportunity. Kingsbury Run was one such place. It was a deep ravine running through the city, lined with tracks, debris, and makeshift shelters. Trains passed through day and night, bringing noise without attention. Smoke hung in the air. The area offered privacy through neglect rather than design. People lived there because they could disappear into it. For many residents of Cleveland, Kingsbury Run was not a place to visit. It was something passed by quickly, glanced at from a distance, then forgotten. It existed within the city, but outside of concern. What happened there rarely reached public conversation unless it could not be ignored. Law enforcement faced limitations. Resources were stretched thin. Priorities focused on visible crime, public order, and economic strain. Disappearances among transient populations did not receive immediate attention. When people left shantytowns, it was assumed they had simply moved on. This environment created silence. Silence where people could vanish without record. Silence where violence could occur without witnesses willing or able to speak. Silence shaped not by conspiracy, but by circumstance. The city itself was not prepared to recognize patterns quickly. Bodies discovered near rail lines were sometimes assumed to be accidents. Remains found months after death were difficult to identify. Without centralized databases or modern forensic methods, connecting cases depended heavily on observation and memory. Cleveland was large enough to absorb loss quietly. The people most affected by instability were often those least connected to institutions that tracked identity. Many carried no identification. Many had no fixed address. Their presence in the city was temporary, and so was their absence. This mattered deeply, because when bodies began to appear in and around Kingsbury Run, the city did not immediately see a series. It saw isolated events. Each discovery existed on its own, separated by time, location, and circumstance. The broader pattern remained hidden behind economic hardship and social fragmentation. Public attention moved slowly. Newspapers reported discoveries, but coverage competed with stories of unemployment, labor unrest, and national uncertainty. Violence did not always stand out in a decade defined by struggle. It blended into the larger noise of survival. Cleveland in the 1930s was not indifferent. It was overwhelmed. And in that overwhelm, certain lives passed through unnoticed. Certain absences did not raise alarm. Certain crimes were slow to be recognized for what they were. This context shaped everything that followed. The city did not ignore the murders because it did not care. It struggled to see them because its attention was pulled in too many directions at once. The environment allowed patterns to form quietly, shielded by hardship and movement. Cleveland was a city still functioning, still breathing, still enduring. And within that endurance, something moved unseen, taking advantage of a silence that had not been created deliberately, but had grown naturally in the space between too many lives and too few resources. This was the city where the story began. Running through the heart of Cleveland was a place most residents preferred not to think about. Kingsbury Run was a deep, narrow ravine carved by time and neglect. Stretching alongside rail lines and industrial corridors, it existed within the city, yet felt separate from it, hidden by geography and indifference rather than distance. The run was not designed for living, but people lived there anyway. During the Great Depression, it became a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. Makeshift shelters rose from discarded wood, metal sheets, and fabric. Fires burned low to avoid attention. The sound of trains passing overhead provided both cover and isolation, drowning out smaller noises and marking time without offering stability. Life in Kingsbury Run was transient by nature. People arrived quietly and left without notice. Names were rarely exchanged. Trust was cautious and temporary. Many who stayed there did so only briefly, moving on when work appeared elsewhere or when conditions became unbearable. Records were not kept. Absence was assumed. The geography of the run reinforced this impermanence. Its steep embankments and twisting paths made it difficult to navigate unless one was familiar with it. Visibility was limited. From above, much of it was hidden. From within, the city felt distant, even though it was only steps away. For Cleveland's residents, Kingsbury Run was a place to pass over, not through. Trains crossed it daily, carrying passengers and freight, but rarely attention. The area became synonymous with poverty and danger, and that reputation allowed it to fade from concern. What happened there was often assumed to be inevitable. Law enforcement presence was minimal. Patrols were infrequent. Reports from the run were treated differently than those from established neighborhoods. Violence was not unexpected there, and as a result, it was sometimes less urgently investigated. This was not written policy, but unspoken reality. This neglect created a particular kind of vulnerability. In Kingsbury Run, people could be harmed without immediate consequence. Witnesses were unlikely to come forward. Victims were difficult to identify. The transient nature of the population meant that disappearance did not always prompt search or alarm. The environment also offered concealment. Dense brush, uneven terrain, and scattered debris created spaces where remains could go unnoticed for long periods. When bodies were discovered, time had often erased clear answers. Identification became difficult. Cause of death was harder to establish. The Run did not announce violence. It absorbed it. This made it an ideal place for crimes to occur without immediate recognition. The geography did not need to be manipulated. It already provided what was required: isolation, silence, and obscurity. As bodies began to be discovered in and around the Run, they did not initially appear connected. Each discovery was treated as its own event. Some were thought to be accidents. Others were assumed to be the result of transient conflict. The idea of a pattern was slow to emerge. Kingsbury Run shaped how the crimes were perceived. Had similar discoveries occurred in residential neighborhoods, response might have been different. But in a place already associated with hardship and instability, tragedy blended into expectation. The setting itself softened alarm. This does not mean the area was devoid of community. People living there shared resources. They watched out for one another in small ways. There were routines, unspoken rules, and fragile networks of support. But these connections did not translate into visibility or protection beyond the Run's boundaries. What happened in Kingsbury Run stayed there, until it could not be ignored. The Run was not merely a backdrop to the crimes. It was part of the story itself. Its geography, its invisibility, and its social isolation shaped how long the violence could continue unnoticed. It was a place where lives could exist without record and end without immediate question. And in that quiet ravine, beneath the movement of trains and the noise of a struggling city, something unfolded slowly, shielded not by secrecy, but by neglect. Kingsbury Run did not create the violence, but it allowed it to remain unseen long enough to become something far more enduring. The first discoveries did not arrive with clarity or alarm. They surfaced gradually, scattered across time and location, and were initially understood as isolated events rather than parts of something larger. In a city already strained by economic hardship, these early findings did not immediately register as extraordinary. In the early 1930s, human remains began to be found along the outskirts of Cleveland, often near rail lines, riverbanks, or industrial areas. Some were uncovered by workers, others were discovered by passers-by. The circumstances varied, but the locations shared a common quality. They were places people rarely lingered, and where attention was minimal. At first, these discoveries were treated individually. Authorities examined each case on its own, searching for explanations that fit familiar patterns. Accidents were considered. Occupational hazards were suspected. In some cases, foul play was acknowledged, but without urgency. The victims were often unidentified, and without names. Their stories ended where they were found. One of the earliest known victims was discovered near Kingsbury Run itself. The remains had been exposed long enough that time had erased many details. Identification proved difficult. Without fingerprints on record or personal belongings to examine, the investigation stalled almost immediately. The case closed quietly, unresolved. More discoveries followed. Bodies appeared months apart, sometimes partially concealed, sometimes exposed by erosion or construction. Each time, the same obstacles emerged. The victims were unknown. The cause of death was difficult to determine, and without witnesses or clear timelines, investigators had little to pursue. The absence of immediate connection allowed the pattern to remain hidden. Each case was absorbed into the broader noise of the city. Newspapers reported the findings, but coverage was brief and factual. There was no narrative yet, no suggestion that these discoveries were related. They were simply unfortunate events in an already difficult decade. What made these early cases particularly easy to overlook was the condition in which the remains were found. In many instances, time and exposure had altered them significantly. This made it challenging to establish how long the victims had been deceased, or what circumstances led to their deaths. Without clear signs of violence, speculation remained cautious. Law enforcement faced limitations that extended beyond resources. Forensic science was still developing. Identification methods were basic. Records were fragmented. Many people living transient lives had no formal documentation. Without a name, a history, or a community asking questions, cases lost momentum quickly. It was only in hindsight that the similarities became apparent. The locations, the condition of the remains, the absence of identification. At the time, these details did not align clearly enough to suggest a single source. Investigators were responding to what they could see, not what they could not yet connect. As discoveries continued, unease began to grow quietly within the police department. There was no single moment where alarm sounded. Instead, concern accumulated. Patterns emerged slowly, pieced together through memory rather than record. Officers began to recognize familiar elements repeating across cases, even as they struggled to articulate what that repetition meant. The realization that something systematic might be unfolding did not arrive fully formed. It arrived as doubt. Doubt that these were accidents. Doubt that these were unrelated. Doubt that the city was witnessing random tragedy rather than something intentional. By the time authorities began to consider the possibility of a serial offender, valuable time had already passed. Early evidence was gone. Witnesses were unavailable. Locations had changed. What might have been observed in the beginning was no longer accessible. The first discoveries did not demand attention. They whispered, and in a city accustomed to hardship and movement, those whispers were easy to miss. It would take further discoveries, closer together and harder to ignore, before the pattern emerged clearly enough to command response. By then, the story had already begun without being named, and the first victims had already been lost not only to violence, but to silence. As the investigation continued, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. Many of the victims discovered in and around Kingsbury Run could not be identified. They existed in records only as descriptions rather than people, reduced to measurements, locations, and conditions rather than names, histories, or connections. This absence of identity shaped everything that followed. In the 1930s, identification depended heavily on community recognition. There were no national databases. Fingerprinting existed, but only for those who had already entered official systems. Many people living transient lives had never been documented in any formal way. Without employment records, fixed addresses, or close relatives nearby, their disappearance left no immediate trace. When bodies were discovered, investigators searched for clues. They examined clothing. They noted physical features. They recorded estimated ages and heights. Sometimes dental work offered a possibility. More often, there was nothing to compare against. Without a missing person report to match, these details remained isolated, unable to connect to a life beyond the moment of discovery. The victims' invisibility did not begin with their deaths. Many had already lived outside the margins of stability. They moved through the city quietly, taking temporary work when it appeared, sleeping where shelter could be found. Their presence was not tracked. Their absence was not questioned. In a city struggling to survive, there was little capacity to notice who had quietly disappeared. This made the investigation fragile. Without names, police could not reconstruct last known movements. They could not identify relationships. They could not ask who might have seen the victims recently, or who might have had reason to harm them. Each unidentified body represented not only a loss of life, but a loss of context. Newspapers referred to the victims in impersonal terms. Descriptions replaced identities. The language reflected distance rather than intimacy. Readers encountered bodies rather than people, discoveries rather than lives interrupted. This framing, while unintentional, reinforced the idea that these deaths belonged to the margins of society rather than its center. Over time, the repetition became clear. Multiple victims shared similar conditions, similar locations, similar absence of identification. The pattern did not rely on who they were, but on who they were not recognized to be. This suggested selection based not on personal grievance, but on vulnerability. The victims' lack of names also influenced public response. Communities mobilized more readily when the missing are known. Faces invite memory. Names invite empathy. Without these anchors, concern remained abstract. The crimes were unsettling, but distant. They did not disrupt the routines of most Cleveland residents directly. For investigators, this presented a painful contradiction. They understood the seriousness of the crimes. They recognized the repetition, yet they were forced to work without the very details that make investigation possible. Each case felt incomplete before it could even begin. Efforts were made to identify the victims. Police circulated descriptions. They consulted other jurisdictions. They checked hospitals, shelters, and employment agencies. Occasionally, a possible match emerged, only to dissolve under scrutiny. More often, nothing surfaced at all. The victims remained unnamed. This anonymity did not diminish their humanity, but it did limit how their stories could be told. Without names, they became symbols rather than individuals. Their lives were reduced to fragments, remembered primarily for how they ended rather than how they were lived. This reality contributed to the enduring mystery of the case. A killer who targets those without names leaves fewer threads to follow. Each act erases not only a person, but the connections that might have led back to responsibility. The violence becomes harder to trace because it removes its own evidence. As more victims were discovered, the list of unidentified grew. Some were eventually given tentative identities. Others remain unknown to this day. Their presence in the case is marked by absence, a reminder of how isolated lives can pass through history without record. The phrase, "victims without names," captures more than investigative difficulty. It speaks to a broader truth about the era, about how economic collapse reshaped visibility, about how suffering concentrated at the edges of society often went unseen until it could no longer be ignored. These victims were not chosen because they were invisible. They became invisible because they were chosen. And in that invisibility, the case deepened, becoming not only a story of violence, but a story of how absence itself can shape history. The victims without names remain at the center of the mystery, not because they are unknown, but because their unknownness explains how the violence endured so long without resolution. Their silence did not begin with death. It began long before, in the spaces where identity faded quietly from record. And it is that silence that continues to echo through the case, unanswered and unresolved. As the number of discoveries grew, investigators began to recognize that what they were seeing could not be explained as a series of unrelated events. Patterns emerged slowly, not through dramatic revelation, but through repetition. Each new case echoed details from those before it, suggesting intention rather than coincidence. The method itself was consistent. Victims were killed in private or secluded places, away from witnesses. The violence occurred out of sight, often in areas already associated with abandonment or neglect. The remains were then left where discovery would be delayed, not entirely hidden, but not immediately visible either. This balance suggested awareness of the environment and how it functioned. One of the most striking elements was what was missing. There was no sign of robbery, no personal belongings taken for value, no attempt to communicate motive through messages or symbols. The acts were not accompanied by demands or claims. They existed without explanation, detached from personal gain or public attention. The condition of the remains revealed further consistency. In multiple cases, bodies were deliberately dismembered. This was not done hastily. It required time, privacy, and a level of control. The precision varied, but the repetition of the act suggested familiarity rather than experimentation. Whoever was responsible did not appear to be learning. The method did not evolve, it repeated. This repetition mattered. It indicated confidence. Confidence that the acts would not be interrupted. Confidence that discovery, when it occurred, would not lead back to the source. The lack of urgency suggested that escape was not a concern. The environment itself provided protection. Another notable pattern was the absence of escalation. There was no obvious increase in frequency or intensity over time. The acts did not become more elaborate. They did not seek greater visibility. This steadiness set the case apart from many others. It suggested a routine rather than a compulsion that demanded expression. Investigators also noted the apparent lack of personal connection between victims. The victims came from similar circumstances, but they were not linked socially or geographically in a way that suggested personal grievance. They did not share known relationships. This reinforced the idea that selection was based on availability rather than familiarity. The pattern pointed toward opportunity. Victims were chosen not because of who they were, but because of where they were and how little attention their absence would draw. This method reduced risk. It minimized witnesses. It delayed response. It allowed time to pass before concern arose. Law enforcement struggled to categorize the behavior. At the time, concepts that would later be formalized in criminal profiling were still emerging. Investigators relied on intuition and comparison rather than established frameworks. They recognized repetition, but they lacked the language to define it fully. The pattern was clear, but interpretation varied. Some believed the acts were driven by ritual. Others believed they were purely practical. Some saw signs of calculation. Others saw evidence of impulse controlled by circumstance. Without direct evidence, these interpretations remained speculative. What remained consistent was restraint. The acts did not seek attention. They did not provoke immediate response. They did not leave behind identifying features or signatures meant to be recognized. The pattern avoided recognition as long as possible. This avoidance allowed the series to continue. Each act blended into the background of the city's broader struggles. Each discovery arrived too late to interrupt the next. The pattern sustained itself through delay rather than speed. For investigators, recognizing the method did not provide a path forward. Understanding how something happened does not always explain who did it or why. In this case, the method clarified behavior but concealed identity. The pattern revealed intention but not motive. The repetition became its own form of silence. It spoke without words. It repeated without variation. It persisted without explanation. And in that persistence, the case took on its defining shape. Not one of chaos, but of controlled repetition. Not one of escalation, but of endurance. The method and pattern did not point outward. They folded inward, reinforcing the same conclusion again and again. Someone was operating within the city, unseen, relying on environment, invisibility, and time. And as long as those conditions remained, the pattern could continue without interruption. As the pattern became harder to dismiss, authorities in Cleveland began to treat the discoveries with greater seriousness. What had once been viewed as isolated tragedies now suggested continuity. Yet recognizing a problem and solving it were very different matters. especially within the limitations of the era. Early investigation efforts were shaped by uncertainty. Police departments did not yet operate with modern coordination or forensic infrastructure. Communication between precincts was limited. Records were kept locally and often inconsistently, without centralized systems. Linking cases depended heavily on individual officers noticing similarities and remembering details across months or years. The first challenge investigators faced was time. Most bodies were discovered long after death. Exposure to weather, animals, and the environment erased evidence before it could be examined. Determining cause of death was difficult. Establishing timelines was often impossible. By the time remains were found, whatever moment of clarity might have existed had already passed. Identification remained the central obstacle. Without names, investigators could not reconstruct last known movements or establish patterns of behavior. They could not trace relationships or determine who might have had contact with the victims. Each unidentified body represented a closed door at the very start of inquiry. Police canvassed areas around discovery sites. They questioned rail workers, residents of nearby shanty towns, and industrial employees. These conversations rarely produced actionable information. People moved frequently, memories blurred. Many witnesses were reluctant to speak, either out of fear or distrust of authorities. The geography of Kingsbury Run complicated matters further. The area's isolation and complexity made thorough searches difficult. Dense brush, uneven terrain, and constant rail traffic disrupted evidence. The run was not static. It changed daily as people moved through it, altering the landscape without record. As pressure increased, investigators began reviewing older cases. They searched for similarities that might link previous unsolved deaths. This retrospective effort was slow and imprecise. Files were incomplete. Descriptions varied. Without standardized reporting, comparisons relied on judgment rather than certainty. Public attention grew gradually. Newspapers began to connect discoveries, publishing articles that suggested a serial offender might be responsible. This attention brought urgency, but also complication. Tips flooded in, many based on rumor or fear rather than observation. Sorting meaningful information from noise became another burden. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin. The city faced rising crime related to economic hardship. Officers were tasked with maintaining public order amid unemployment, protests, and unrest. The Torso murders competed with many other priorities. Even as concern grew, focus was divided. Early investigative efforts were earnest, but fragmented. Different units pursued different leads. Some focused on transient populations, others examined known criminals. Still others believed the answers lay within Kingsbury Run itself. Without a unifying strategy, efforts overlapped without converging. Despite these challenges, investigators did recognize the seriousness of what they were facing. They increased patrols in affected areas. They monitored rail lines more closely. They attempted to track movements of known violent offenders. These measures provided reassurance, but little progress. The absence of immediate results bred frustration. Each new discovery reinforced the sense that the killer was operating beyond reach. The methods used left little behind. The environment erased what remained, and the victim's anonymity removed the most basic investigative tool of all, a starting point. Early efforts did not fail because of indifference. They failed because the problem exceeded the tools available to address it. The crimes exploited gaps in record-keeping, social visibility, and investigative capability. The system struggled not from lack of will, but from lack of structure. By the time authorities understood the scale of the situation, the foundation for solving it had already eroded. The early investigation efforts laid groundwork, but they did not produce answers. They marked the moment when the city acknowledged the pattern, even as it struggled to interrupt it. And as the investigation continued forward, it did so under growing pressure, aware that time was not an ally, and that each delay deepened the silence it was trying to overcome. As the series of murders continued without resolution, pressure mounted on city leadership to change course. Public concern had grown beyond quiet unease. The pattern was now widely acknowledged, and Cleveland needed a response that signaled seriousness and control. That response arrived in the form of Elliot Ness. Ness was already a national figure by the time he arrived in Cleveland. Known for his role in enforcing prohibition and confronting organized crime, he carried a reputation for discipline and integrity. His appointment as Director of Public Safety placed him in charge of both the police and fire departments, granting him authority to restructure operations and set priorities. When Ness turned his attention to the Torso murders, he approached them with the tools and mindset he knew best. He believed in order, visibility, and deterrence. The crimes, in his view, thrived in darkness and neglect. If those conditions could be disrupted, the violence might stop. One of Ness's first actions was to increase police presence in and around Kingsbury Run. Patrols were intensified. Officers were assigned to monitor rail yards and transient areas more closely. The goal was not only to catch an offender, but to remove the sense of invisibility that had allowed the crimes to persist. Ness also focused on organization within the police department. He pushed for better record-keeping, clearer communication between units, and a more centralized approach to the investigation. While these measures seem routine today, they represented meaningful change at the time. Ness understood that fragmented effort had limited effectiveness, especially against a pattern that relied on delay and disconnection. Despite these changes, progress remained limited. The murders had not left behind the kind of evidence Ness was accustomed to working with. There were no financial trails, no informants, no networks to dismantle. The offender did not communicate. There were no demands or claims of responsibility. The case did not behave like organized crime. It resisted infiltration. Ness authorized aggressive measures in response. In a controversial decision, shantytowns within Kingsbury Run were cleared and burned. The intent was to remove hiding places and force visibility. By dismantling informal settlements, Ness hoped to disrupt whatever environment the killer relied upon. The action was decisive, but its effectiveness remains debated. For those living in the run, the clearances brought displacement rather than safety. Many were forced to move elsewhere, scattering a population already difficult to track. While the action signaled authority, it also removed potential witnesses and further fractured fragile communities. Interrogations intensified. Police questioned known criminals, transients, and individuals who fit speculative profiles. Some were detained for extended questioning. A few were considered strong suspects for brief periods, only to be released when evidence failed to materialize. Ness demanded results, but the case continued to resist conclusion. The pressure on the Cleveland police was constant. Newspapers followed every development. Public expectation grew heavier with each passing month. The lack of arrests became a measure of failure, even as officers worked with limited tools. Morale suffered. Frustration mounted. Ness himself became a focal point. His reputation amplified scrutiny. If someone like Elliot Ness could not solve the case, it suggested that the problem lay beyond individual leadership. The mystery did not yield to authority or visibility. It remained quiet, persistent, and unresolved. Eventually, the murders stopped. No announcement marked their end. There was no arrest that explained the silence. The discoveries simply ceased. For some, this suggested that Ness's actions had worked. For others, it raised new questions. Had the killer left the area? Had circumstances changed? Or had opportunity simply vanished? Without answers, interpretation replaced certainty. Ness continued to serve in Cleveland, but the Torso murders remained an unfinished chapter. They did not define his career, yet they followed it quietly, representing a limit that even strong leadership could not overcome. The involvement of Eliot Ness did not resolve the case. It changed its shape. The investigation became more visible. The city responded with force and organization. And still, the truth remained out of reach. The case demonstrated that some crimes do not yield to pressure, structure, or reputation. They persist because they were built on silence. And when that silence finally settled, it did so without explanation, leaving behind a legacy defined not by capture, but by the enduring absence of answers. As pressure intensified to produce answers, the investigation moved into a phase defined less by evidence and more by examination of people who seemed, in one way or another, close enough to possibility. Suspects emerged not because proof demanded it, but because the absence of proof left space that needed to be filled. Police questioned many individuals. Some were known criminals, some were transient workers, others were simply people who happened to be nearby. Interrogations were frequent and often repetitive, shaped by intuition rather than confirmation. Investigators searched for inconsistencies in stories, changes in behavior, or any detail that might suggest familiarity with the crimes. Most conversations ended where they began, without resolution. One of the most discussed suspects was Frank Dolezal, a man known to police who had connections to at least one of the victims. He was arrested and interrogated extensively. Under pressure, he provided a confession that was later retracted. The details did not align with known facts, and physical evidence did not support his involvement. Dolezal died while in custody, under circumstances that raised further questions rather than answers. His death removed a suspect without clarifying the truth, leaving behind a shadow of suspicion that could neither be confirmed nor dismissed completely. For investigators, it was another closed door that offered no clarity. Other suspects came and went. Men who lived in or near Kingsbury Run were questioned because of proximity. Transient laborers were interrogated because they could move unnoticed. Some individuals were detained briefly based on rumor or tip, only to be released when no evidence emerged. The nature of interrogation during this era added complexity. Interview techniques relied heavily on persistence and psychological pressure. Confessions were valued, sometimes more than corroboration. This created risk. Statements could be shaped by fear, exhaustion, or the desire to escape questioning rather than by truth. Investigators were aware of this limitation, even if they could not fully avoid it. They attempted to corroborate statements with timelines and witness accounts, but these too were unreliable. Memories faded, locations shifted, people moved on. Each attempt to anchor suspicion dissolved under scrutiny. Another challenge was volume. Tips arrived constantly, especially after newspapers began referring to the crimes as the work of a single individual. Citizens reported suspicious neighbors, strangers seen near rail lines, or people who behaved oddly. Most of these leads ended quickly, but each required time and attention. As more suspects were questioned and released, confidence eroded. The investigation began to feel circular. The same types of individuals were examined repeatedly. The same questions were asked. The same lack of evidence persisted. Interrogations became acts of endurance rather than progress. Some suspects were remembered not because of evidence, but because of how closely they fit public imagination. Those with violent histories, those who lived outside social norms, those who could not easily explain their movements. Yet fitting an image was not the same as establishing guilt. Eliot Ness and other officials were careful not to declare conclusions publicly. They understood the damage accusation could cause without proof. Still, the absence of arrests weighed heavily. Public expectation demanded progress, and suspicion became a substitute. Over time, interrogations slowed. The pool of plausible suspects narrowed not because answers were found, but because possibilities were exhausted. Many individuals once questioned were eliminated quietly. Others remained unresolved, their involvement neither proven nor disproven. The interrogations did not fail because they were insufficient. They failed because the crime left too little behind. The offender did not speak. The environment erased traces. The victim's anonymity removed connections. Each interrogation ended the same way it began, with uncertainty intact. What remained was a list of names without conclusions, interviews without outcomes, and questions that could not be pressed any further without evidence to support them. The suspects did not lead to the killer. They led back to silence. And as the investigation moved forward, it carried with it the knowledge that every voice examined had failed to reveal the one voice that mattered. The case would continue, but this phase marked a turning point, not toward resolution, but toward acceptance that answers might never arrive through questioning alone. The interrogations had reached their limit, and beyond that limit, only quiet remained. As the investigation in Cleveland stalled, attention gradually widened beyond the city's boundaries. Investigators and later researchers began to ask whether the violence seen along Kingsbury Run might not be confined to one place, but instead part of a broader pattern unfolding across the region. This question did not arise from new evidence, but from comparison. In the years surrounding the Cleveland murders, other cities reported discoveries that felt uncomfortably similar. Human remains were found near rail lines, waterways, and industrial areas. In some cases, bodies were dismembered. In others, victims were unidentified. Each case existed on its own, but together they formed a troubling backdrop. One city often mentioned in these discussions is Pittsburgh. There, remains were discovered under circumstances that echoed Cleveland's experience. The locations were secluded. The victims were difficult to identify. Investigations struggled to move forward. At the time, no formal connection was made, but later observers would note the similarities. Further west, Chicago also recorded cases involving dismemberment and unidentified victims during the same era. As with Cleveland, these crimes occurred in a city shaped by rail travel, migration, and economic pressure. The movement of people through Chicago made it difficult to track who belonged and who had disappeared. These similarities prompted speculation about mobility. The Great Depression created constant movement. People traveled by train in search of work. Laborers passed through cities without leaving records. A person could appear briefly, commit violence, and leave again without drawing attention. Rail lines connected cities quietly, offering opportunity without visibility. Supporters of a broader theory pointed to timing. The Cleveland murders did not occur in isolation from history. They unfolded during a decade defined by instability and displacement. Other violent crimes during this period may have shared causes rather than perpetrators. Distinguishing between coincidence and connection became difficult. Law enforcement at the time lacked the tools to test these possibilities. There were no centralized databases. Communication between jurisdictions was limited. Crimes in one city were not easily compared to those in another. Even when similarities were noticed, proving connection was nearly impossible. This limitation allowed speculation to grow unchecked. Some believed the same individual traveled between cities, repeating the same method. Others believed different offenders responded to similar conditions in similar ways. Both interpretations fit the available information, and neither could be confirmed. What is clear is that Cleveland was not alone in facing violence shaped by invisibility. Across the country, crimes against marginalized individuals often went unresolved. Victims without names appeared in multiple cities, discovered too late to provide answers. The pattern may have been broader than a single offender. reflecting a moment in history where certain lives were easier to erase. As years passed, researchers revisited these cases with fresh perspective. They mapped timelines, they compared methods, they searched for overlap. Some found compelling parallels. Others cautioned against forcing connection where evidence did not support it. The debate remains unresolved. The idea of torso murders beyond Cleveland persists because it addresses a deeper uncertainty. It asks whether the crimes were the result of one hidden figure or many unseen forces, whether silence followed a person or a period, whether the violence was mobile or simply widespread. In the absence of proof, restraint remains necessary. The Cleveland murders stand on their own, defined by location and circumstance. Yet they exist within a wider landscape of unresolved violence that characterized the era. The boundaries between cases blur not because they are the same, but because they emerged from similar conditions. The broader view does not bring clarity. It expands the silence. By looking outward, the investigation did not find answers, but context. It revealed how easily violence could move unnoticed through a fractured society, and how difficult it was to contain or explain. Whether the torso murders extended beyond Cleveland remains unanswered. What remains certain is that the city's experience was not unique in its struggle to see, name, and resolve violence that thrived in the margins. And in that shared uncertainty, the case grows larger, not clearer, carried forward by questions that refuse to settle into one place or one explanation. At some point, without announcement or explanation, the discoveries ended. Bodies were no longer found along Kingsbury Run. Reports slowed, then stopped altogether. The pattern that had emerged quietly over years simply ceased, leaving behind questions that felt heavier because they were unanswered. There was no clear moment that marked the end. No arrest was made, no confession surfaced. No event explained the sudden absence of violence. The silence arrived gradually, almost unnoticed at first. Investigators continued their work, expecting the next discovery to appear as it had before. When it did not, uncertainty replaced urgency. For some, the end of the murders suggested intervention. The increased police presence, the clearing of shantytowns, the heightened attention from city officials. These measures may have disrupted whatever conditions had allowed the crimes to continue. Visibility increased. Opportunity diminished. If the offender relied on neglect and isolation, the environment may no longer have offered protection. Others believed the explanation lay elsewhere. The person responsible may have left the area. Movement during the Great Depression was constant. People traveled in search of work, shelter, or anonymity. It would not have been difficult for someone to disappear into another city, carrying silence with them. There was also the possibility of death, illness, accident, incarceration for an unrelated crime. Without identity, even the absence of an offender could not be confirmed. The case offered no way to determine what had changed, only that something had. For investigators, this created a difficult paradox. The end of violence was welcomed, but it did not bring relief. Without resolution, the silence felt incomplete. It closed one chapter without finishing the story. The murders stopping did not answer the question of who was responsible, or why the crimes had occurred at all. Files remained open. Leads continued to be reviewed. Tips were still received. But with no new incidents to examine, momentum slowed. The investigation shifted from pursuit to maintenance, preserving records rather than building toward conclusion. Public attention faded as well. New concerns took precedence. The city moved forward. The decade carried on. What had once felt urgent became part of the past, referenced occasionally but no longer present in daily conversation. Yet the absence lingered. The lack of explanation left space for speculation. Every theory remained possible because none could be disproven. The silence at the end of the crimes mirrored the silence that had allowed them to continue in the first place. There was no sense of victory, only uncertainty. The end did not feel like an ending. It felt like interruption, as though something had paused rather than concluded. The story did not resolve. It simply stopped adding chapters. For families of the victims, this brought no closure. There was no justice to acknowledge, no truth to hold on to. The absence of further violence did not restore what had been lost or explain why it had happened. The murder stopping did not complete the narrative. It left it suspended. A series defined not by its conclusion, but by its disappearance. Much like the lives it had taken, the violence faded without leaving behind an explanation. And in that quiet ending, the case entered its final phase. Not as a solved mystery, not as a closed chapter, but as something unresolved, carried forward by memory rather than answers. The silence returned, and this time it stayed. With no arrest and no explanation for why the murders stopped, the case gradually transformed from an active investigation into a landscape of theories. These ideas did not replace evidence. They existed because evidence had failed to arrive. Each theory attempted to give shape to absence, offering structure where certainty was missing. One of the earliest theories centered on opportunity rather than identity. The crimes may have continued only as long as conditions allowed. Kingsbury Run offered isolation, invisibility, and delay. When those conditions changed through increased patrols and displacement, the opportunity may have vanished. In this view, the murders stopped not because the offender was caught, but because the environment no longer permitted silence. Another theory focused on mobility. The Great Depression created constant movement. People traveled by rail without documentation, drifting between cities in search of work or shelter. If the offender relied on this mobility, leaving Cleveland would have been simple. The absence of further crimes locally would not indicate an end, only a relocation beyond visibility. There is also the possibility of interruption by circumstance. Illness, injury, or death could have ended the pattern without announcement. Incarceration for an unrelated offense could have removed the offender from opportunity. These explanations are difficult to confirm because they leave no trace that connects back to the crimes. Some theories focus on occupation. The method suggested familiarity with tools and anatomy. This led to speculation about professions that required precision and access to equipment. But without a suspect to examine, these ideas remain conceptual rather than evidentiary. They describe possibility, not proof. Others questioned whether there was only one offender at all. The similarities across cases may reflect shared conditions rather than a single hand. Violence against marginalized individuals during the era may have produced patterns that appear unified in hindsight but were independent in origin. This interpretation suggests the case is less about one person and more about a moment in history. This theory is unsettling in a different way. It implies that the violence was not exceptional, but systemic, that multiple individuals could act similarly without coordination because the environment allowed it. That silence was not caused by one hidden figure, but by widespread neglect. What remains consistent across all theories is limitation. Each explanation fits some details and fails others. Each accounts for part of the story while leaving gaps untouched. None can be tested conclusively. None can be ruled out completely. The unanswered questions persist. Why were the victims chosen? Why was the method so consistent? Why did the murders stop when they did? Why was no identity ever confirmed? These questions remain not because they were ignored, but because they resisted resolution. Over time, the case has been revisited by historians and criminologists who bring modern frameworks to old facts. New interpretations emerge. Old assumptions are challenged. Yet without new evidence, progress remains interpretive rather than definitive. The theories do not compete for truth. They coexist. Each offers a lens through which to view the same absence. Together, they form a constellation of possibilities rather than a conclusion. The case does not narrow with time. It expands outward, accommodating uncertainty rather than resolving it. This is perhaps the most enduring aspect of the story. The mystery does not demand solution. It endures quietly, unchanged by speculation. The unanswered questions remain exactly where they began, suspended between what is known and what can never be confirmed. In the end, the theories tell us as much about our need for explanation as they do about the crimes themselves. They remind us that not every mystery yields to analysis, that some questions remain open not because they lack importance, but because they exist beyond reach. The case continues to exist in this space, not solved, not forgotten, but quietly present. And it is in that quiet, unresolved state that the story moves toward its final reflection, carrying with it questions that remain unanswered, and perhaps always will. As years passed, the case of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury runs slowly settled into history. It no longer occupied newspaper headlines or daily conversation. Instead, it became something quieter, carried forward through records, memory, and unanswered questions, rather than active pursuit. For the city of Cleveland, the murders left a subtle but lasting imprint. They did not define the city, but they altered how certain spaces were perceived. Areas once overlooked were no longer entirely invisible. Rail corridors, ravines, and industrial edges carried a different weight, shaped by the knowledge of what had gone unnoticed there before. Law enforcement practices evolved in the years that followed. Advances in forensic science, record-keeping, and interdepartmental communication emerged partly in response to cases like this one. The inability to identify victims, link crimes, or preserve evidence became lessons carried forward. The case stood as an example of what silence and fragmentation could allow. Yet for all the institutional change, the individuals at the center of the story remained largely unknown. Most of the victims were never identified. Their lives were not reconstructed. Their histories did not return to public view. They remained present only through absence, remembered not for who they were, but for the mystery surrounding their deaths. This anonymity shaped the legacy of the case. Unlike crimes tied to specific names or dramatic confrontations, this story resisted personalization. It remained abstract, defined by patterns rather than personalities. The focus shifted from individuals to environment, from motive to circumstance. Over time, the case drew the attention of historians and researchers. Books were written, articles revisited, old files, theories were debated. Each generation brought new interpretation, but no new resolution. The story remained open, not because it was actively investigated, but because it had never been closed. The quiet nature of the aftermath is what distinguishes this case. There was no final reckoning, no moment of justice, no public acknowledgement that could settle the past. The story ended not with conclusion, but with endurance. For those who lived through the era, the murders became something spoken about carefully, if at all. For later generations, they became a historical shadow, known through retelling rather than experience. The emotional distance grew, even as the mystery remained intact. The case also became a reminder that violence does not always announce itself, that it can persist without spectacle, that some crimes leave behind more questions than answers, and that those questions can remain unanswered indefinitely. The legacy of the Mad Butcher is not found in resolution. It is found in what changed afterward, in how silence was recognized as dangerous, in how invisibility came to be understood as vulnerability, in how absence itself became evidence of systemic failure rather than individual mystery. And yet, even with this understanding, the story does not conclude. The case remains open in the quietest sense, not awaiting a breakthrough, but existing as a record of what could not be fully understood. It does not demand attention. It does not seek closure. It simply remains. A chapter in history defined by restraint, by unanswered questions, and by the knowledge that some stories do not resolve, but instead fade gently into the background, leaving behind a silence that history continues to carry. This is the legacy that endures, not an ending, but a quiet aftermath. As the story of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run settles into stillness, what remains is not a conclusion, but a quiet space where certainty never arrived. The crimes ended without explanation, the investigation reached its limits, and the city moved forward, carrying questions that were never resolved. Time has a way of softening urgency. What once demanded answers becomes part of history. The details remain, but the weight shifts. The case no longer presses for solution. It exists instead as a reminder of how easily silence can take shape, and how long it can remain undisturbed. The absence of resolution does not diminish the story. If anything, it defines it. The lack of a final answer reflects the conditions in which the crimes occurred. Invisibility, movement, and neglect shaped both the violence and its aftermath. The same forces that allowed the crimes to unfold also prevented them from being fully understood. For the victims, remembrance does not require identity. They are remembered through the acknowledgement of what was taken, even if names were never restored. Their presence in history exists through the recognition of absence, a quiet acknowledgement that lives were lost without explanation. For the city, the case became part of a larger awareness. It revealed how environments can conceal harm, how social margins can hide suffering, and how progress sometimes arrives not through justice, but through recognition of failure. As night settles, there is no need to search for answers. This story does not ask to be solved. It asks only to be remembered calmly, without urgency or demand. The questions can remain open. The uncertainty can rest. If your thoughts begin to drift, allow them to slow. Let the details fade. Let the silence remain gentle. Let the night continue without interruption. The city sleeps. The rail lines are quiet. The ravine holds only shadow and memory. Nothing more is required of you now. The story has been told as far as it can go, and as the night deepens, you are free to rest, knowing that some stories do not end with answers, but with quiet understanding. Good night.